Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 1 o'clock our time, and so I would like to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Tobin, and I am a research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. I'm also working on the TRAFIG project and am your moderator and host today. So I'd like to welcome you to the 6th of our Zooming in on migration and asylum webinars as part of this series. And a couple of sort of housekeeping notes about this before we get started. The webinar is going to be streamed live on YouTube, and later the video will be available on demand. The chat function in Zoom will not be made visible on the later video. So do please pose your questions during the live portion so that we may be able to answer them during the course of the webinar. As I mentioned, I'm with the TRAFIG project, and between 2019 and 2021, there are 12 partner organizations that are working together to research in Asia, Africa, and Europe the situation of protracted displacement in these areas. The central research question for TRAFIG is how are protractedness, dependency, and vulnerability related to the factors of local and translocal connectivity and mobility, and how can connectivity and mobility be utilized to enhance the self-reliance and strengthen the resilience of displaced persons. And our research question becomes particularly important today during our webinar entitled Refugee Responses to Ongoing Displacement. Today we have a large number of really notable, important researchers from around the world joining us, and it's a real joy and honor to have them. Also, a quick note, the next webinar will occur on January 26th, and it will be moderated and hosted by AdMigov, one of the other projects that is co-organizing and hosting and running the webinar series. And the title of the next webinar will be Labor Migrants and Contractual and Working Conditions under COVID-19. So today we're going to talk about refugee responses to ongoing displacement. I am sure you all read the abstracts, but just a quick reminder. With continued record levels of displacement around the globe, solutions in the true sense of the word remain elusive for many. This webinar today will explore different strategies that refugees and IDPs are using to respond to displacement-related challenges. Speakers will highlight examples of solutions found by those who are displaced themselves, based on the field research that TRAFIG has conducted in Ethiopia and in Jordan. These often go beyond those commonly recognized forms, including strategies related to the themes of connectivity and mobility I just mentioned. The speakers today will also examine the global need for durable solutions and check in on the global compacts 2 years after their signing. The speakers today that we have, I'm going to quickly introduce them and read their bios for you, their biographies. And then after I'm finished with that, we have a short video on the TRAFIG project that we will be showing to you. And following that, then we will open up the content of the webinar. So the first speaker we have today is Professor Emeritus of Refugee Studies, Roger Zetter. He is a well-known expert, academic, thinker, and influencer in the field of refugee studies. He's conducted over 50 research and consultancy projects with all of the well-known international organizations. And some of his recent research includes protracted refugee situations, climate and environmental change, and population displacement, which is going to be, I think, even more important into the future. Also projects on development-led responses to the economic costs and impacts of forced migration, labor market access, humanitarian development nexus, protection and forced displacement, as well as the framing of humanitarian principles. He's very prolific, has written over 45 journal articles, 6 books, 32 book chapters. If my career were a fraction of this amazing, I would consider it a success. So it's a real joy to have Roger with us today. Our next speaker after Roger will be Dr. Fadaku Tufa. Dr. Fidakku has obtained his PhD in social anthropology from the Martin Luther University in Germany. He's an assistant professor at Addis Ababa University in social anthropology. His research areas of interest are migration, refugees, borderlands, identity, conflict management, land deals, and pastoralism. He's been a principal investigator and coordinator of a number of large international projects, including, for example, funded by DFID, Borderlands Dynamics in East Africa, and migration out of poverty. So we are excited to have Dr. Fidakku Tufa here today. We also have Mulu Getachew, who is pursuing her PhD in social anthropology at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Her dissertation title is Living in the Face of Uncertainty, the Life of Eritrean Refugees in Ethiopia. Mulu also wrote her MA thesis on the lived experiences of Eritrean refugees, the case of Mai Ani refugee camp in Tigray National Regional State, which for those who've been following migration news lately, the Tigray state has become very important once again on concerns of global refugees. We also have, if needed, Dr. Marcus Rudolph standing in to assist if the internet fails us. Dr. Marcus is a social anthropologist from BIC, and he has been working closely with the Ethiopia team, and he will be nearby if we need, hopefully able to contribute with full internet, still working for us all. When we turn to the Jordan team, we have 2 team members involved in the project. Dr. Fawaz Momini, he is the local lead in Jordan on our work package in the TRAFIG project. Fawaz and I have been working closely together over the course of the TRAFIG project. He is an associate professor of psychological counseling and former director of the Refugees, Displaced Persons, and Forced Migration Studies Center at Yarmouk University in Jordan. He has expertise in forced migration, has published widely on the topic of forced migration as well, and he's a member of the T20 task force. He has worked on a large number of international projects with running grants from many different funding agencies, all related to the implementing projects on refugees and the host community. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Tamara Adel Yacoub. She's an assistant professor in the Public Administration Department. She did her PhD at Keele University in the UK, and her thesis focused on key issues and challenges facing public policy formulations in Jordan. She has previous experience working with international aid agencies and is a senior specialist in that field. She has experience related to refugee issues since 2006. One of her earlier projects was as a coordinator at JICA and working on related issues with Palestinian refugees in Jordan. She's also worked as a research assistant on a co-funded study by the EU on forced migration of Syrians to Jordan, an exploratory study. In addition to her PhD thesis, she has examined the massive influx of Syrian refugees to Jordan and its impact on Jordan's national plans and policies, focusing specifically on the health sector. So at this point, TRAFIG has a short video, and then after that, we will turn it over to Roger for the opening comments.
"60% of refugees worldwide are forced to live into protracted displacement. That's more than 16 million people who live for years and years without prospects of returning, moving elsewhere, or integrating into local society. How do people caught in protracted displacement manage their day-to-day lives? What do they rely on? The relations between refugees and hosts are crucial, but cross-border networks also play a big role. Transnational connections and mobility are important resources to improve their lives. TRAFIG is a research consortium that examines the role of transnational connections and mobility as resources for refugees. The consortium is funded under the EU's Horizon 2020 program and brings together more than 60 researchers and professionals from 12 partner organizations. Our research takes place in 9 countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. TRAFIG carries out transdisciplinary applied research. We provide data, information, and advice to policymakers, practitioners, and academics. The needs and capacities of displaced people lie at the core of our research.
Thank you very much. At this point, we will turn it over to Roger for his opening comments for about the next 10 minutes. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your extremely generous introduction. It was highly embarrassing, and thank you indeed to TRAFIG for inviting me to make this short opening statement. I'm commenting really on the Global Compact, plus 2 years, not as an empirical researcher in the Compact, but really as I think, an informed observer and commentator on a lot of the dimensions and the building blocks, as it were, that form the Compact and the CRRF. I want to make 3 preliminary points and then gear my comments, 5 or 6 comments, a little more specifically about the achievements of Compact and the challenges it's had, but gearing those comments as far as possible, I think, to from a very big, potentially very big portfolio of comments, but gearing them very much to the themes of TRAFIG and the other 3 Horizon 2020 projects that are part of this Zooming consortium. I suppose if one looks back at the process of developing the Compact, if one looks at the components of the Compact itself, the CRRF, the plan of action, if one looks at the really complex, challenging range of 23 objectives that the Compact set for itself, I suppose the first and most obvious point is how remarkably this was achieved before COVID. One could not imagine the kind of diplomacy, the engagement of policymakers, the engagement of national governments across the world producing the Compact, and then leading obviously the Global Refugee Forum in 2019. One could not imagine this taking place now. So I suppose the first and obvious point, the significant figuration, we should be grateful that this reconfiguring the architecture took place before COVID, despite the fact, as I'll say, the minute that COVID has put a bit of a kind of blockage on how the Compact has rolled out. Nevertheless, the fact that it is in place is a remarkable and a very important achievement. Second comment is, I think we need to look at the Compact very much as work in progress in 2 respects. First of all, it was undeniably a very, very important milestone in the development of the global refugee regime over the last decades. But also it was work in progress in the sense that it consolidated and to a certain extent retrofitted, I think, quite a lot of progress that had already been taking place up to that point. I'm thinking particularly here of the humanitarian development nexus, for example, and we know that sustainable development is a core component of the Compact. But one could look at the Syrian 3RP, which had been in place for quite a number of years before the Compact was actually agreed, as a key process, a key strategy, if you like, of developing sustainable development responses to refugee replacement. Recognizing the agency of refugees, that was already well established. The importance of host refugee partnerships. So without sounding to be critical and cynical about what the Global Compact was about, the fact that it was work in progress, it nevertheless, I think, was very important in consolidating a lot of what I would call the kind of soft norms, if you like, or soft principles of responses to large-scale protracted refugee crises. It's also important to think of it as work in progress from a second perspective, in that it's not setting out some kind of ideal end state solution, homogeneous solution to protracted displacement globally. It's setting out strategic directions, strategic parameters, in some ways a framework, as I say, of kind of soft norms and principles, of plans of action. And I think it will take a very considerable time, maybe 5, even 10 years, to discern whether the Compact, the strategies, the policies, the programs, the huge array of pledges to implement the Compact. It will take a long time, I think, to really see how these are playing out. And I think we have to remember, of course, that it is not a kind of one size fits all. Different countries, even different regions within countries, will be developing different strategies around the framework, the architecture of the Compact. The third general point, I think, is inevitably, I suppose one has to insert the big C word here, COVID. Undeniably, it has had a huge and challenging impact on the progress of the compact. It's not that the compact is on hold, but it is certainly, I think, slowed progress because, and particularly, I think, in terms of the kind of projects that Horizon 2020 is dealing with, about cross-border configurations, about mixed migration routes, about protracted displacement, about development strategies. All these, I think, are under severe pressure because of COVID. Countries, as we know, are restricting cross-border travel very, very severely. Some have closed borders entirely to try and contain the virus. This kind of closure and public health concerns and so on have been a rationale to limit access to development opportunities, to healthcare by refugees in their country, in their host countries. It's been used covertly and I think not so covertly as a way of restricting access to humanitarian and protection pathways. And at the moment when I suppose every country is facing this kind of common threat that actually transcends borders, the virus, the paradox is, of course, that they have turned their gaze inwards and have become much more introspective and much more controlling of the kind of migratory processes that we're very concerned with as researchers and policymakers, and of course the strategies which are vital for the livelihoods and long-term survival of refugees and migrants. I think also the most worrying impact of COVID is going to be a long-term impact, not just on issues of protection and containment, but with every country now facing a meltdown, if you like, in its economic prospects, particularly the donor countries. There's going to be a downturn, I think, in development assistance. There's going to be a downturn in donor engagement with refugees and the long-term development aspects of the compact and the humanitarian development nexus. And I think the diminution of funding for refugees, for host governments, supporting the majority of host governments who are hosting protracted refugees, this I think is going to be a very, very severe long-term impact. Looking now a little more specifically, what could we say the compact has achieved? What have been the challenges? I'd like to highlight perhaps 5 or 6 outcomes that I think speak from a huge range of possible topics to the H2020 projects on governance, on migration management and development and transnationalism. First of all, I think we can see that the kind of institutional architecture envisaged by the compact has in fact been quite effective. I'm thinking particularly here in Latin America with the response to the huge Venezuelan exodus. What we see there is that although the response is patchy, there has been some positive at national government and at regional levels to try and address the very widespread impact of Venezuelan displacement in countries like Colombia, Ecuador. We see a much more coordinated response within those countries to the impact. We see a much more proactive response in terms of rights to work, looking at the long-term sustainable responses to the refugees in those countries. And so I think it is good news that these first sort of new tests, so to speak, of the compact strategy with the Venezuelan crisis, it has stood up pretty well in terms of a kind of institutional response. It offered a common language and paved the way for policy reform, policy engagement. Second comment, and again, one of the core components of the compact, development-led sustainable responses. I think we can see that this has been, again, quite effective, particularly in Latin America, changes to national legislation on the right to work. One of the core components, I think that has taken place. I think we also see that the compact created a kind of routeway, created an environment, created the opportunity and the invitation for new funding streams, particularly through maximizing private sector support, which again was one of the objectives of the compact. And we see private sector support both in terms of corporate entities, their commercial arms being engaged with refugee support and sustainable development, but also through sort of philanthropic engagement. Google, as we know, has been supporting the growth of online and digital services and businesses for and by refugees. I think all this seems, again, very kind of progressive and positive. directed to the core objective of the compact. But again, I think there are major challenges. What kind of employment? Ethiopia, for example, there's been a lot of criticism of the way the compact and the kind of employment, the location of employment, the types of employment that have been created for refugees. Is it sustainable employment? Is it gender relevant? Or is it just an extension of kind of neoliberal globalization and new niche market, which is something that I've been writing about? So I think whilst one could say that the developmental approach has certainly been sustained and promoted by the compact, there are still many questions about how that is rolling out globally and in particular countries. A third, I think, element, a core of the compact, and possibly the most contentious, was the notion of burden sharing. But burden sharing was never really nailed down in the compact in terms of a concept, in terms of the metrics, in terms of implementation. There are lots and lots of pledges now. One can see over 1,400 pledges on the UNHCR compact website. But these are mostly about institution building, about coordination. They're about process-related activities. They're not material, humanitarian, development assistance, a reconfiguration of the global streams of finance to refugee impacted countries. And as I say, I think COVID-19 is going to have a very severe impact on burden sharing, on the commitment of global North donors, multilaterals and so on to support refugee, sustainable refugee development when our own countries are in a process of severe economic retrenchment. The third area, which I think is again very significant, is the development of what's called the Asylum Capacity Support Group. There are a lot of pledges, I think, here one can see for assistance, and the Asylum Capacity, the ACSG, the Asylum Capacity Support Group, is a mechanism, a framework which UNHCR has set up to provide support and assistance to developing asylum and refugee status determination systems in different countries, trying to increase the consistency and availability of support to national asylum systems. And I think we can see that this is actually quite a positive improvement. Quite a lot of development, I think, has taken place in terms of trying to develop fair, efficient, adaptable refugee status determination systems. And I think this has very important implications for the Horizon 2020 projects in terms of particularly those projects that are looking at issues of migration governance, looking at mixed migration strategies, and so on and so forth. A fifth point, as I've said, the pledges. The pledges are, if you like, one of the key vehicles to implement the compact. 1,400 of them, an enormous range. It's very difficult, though, I think, to get a sense of where they are all leading. It's almost a kind of cafeteria. If you go on the pledges website, there's an enormous range of very micro projects, some of which I think speak very much to the kind of Horizon 2020 projects about very localized partnerships, development of initiatives for hosts and refugees, developing business capacity at the local level and so on. But it's very, very hard to get a sense of strategically how this is building up to a fundamentally new approach to sustainable, to tackling in a sustainable way, protracted displacement. Some criticisms, nothing on climate change. That's the sixth point. Seventh point, very little progress I can see in terms of refugee voices and policy making. Compact had one of its major objectives was the notion of a strong participatory involvement of refugees in policy making, in decision making. It's a well-known mantra in the refugee policy field for decades and decades, a participatory approach. And that was rehearsed again in the compact. Frankly, I don't see much change. I don't see a real shift in engagement, partnership with refugees and a centralization of refugee voices. And my final comment really is, I've talked about the refugee compact. I haven't talked about the migration compact, but what I think is particularly disturbing in terms of long-term strategies, particularly where one's dealing with, in a sense, a new world of international migration, mobility, mixed migration, different pathways of migration, different trajectories. The two compacts are still silos. They're following different trajectories. They're growing apart from each other rather than together. There's still no answer to some of these really pressing questions facing sovereign countries, countries of origin, the transit countries, and the countries that are trying to block migrants arriving, like Europe and the US. We do not really have a global framework to manage large-scale international migration, people on the move, people in need of protection, different kinds of protection and assistance, their rights as mobile people. How do we deal with mixed migration? How do we deal with the governance of protection? We've still got the two silos, the two compacts. Many of us perhaps sort of philosophically and optimistically hoped that there would only be one compact when the initiative started in in 2016 in the UN in New York. But in fact, we have these two silos. And I think people will continue to move across borders. States will continue to press for answers as to how to address these complex movements, how to accord effective humanitarian protection, and how to sustain well-established human rights obligations. And I don't see the way in which the two compacts are diverging from each other is going to provide these kind of fundamental answers. So that's my very brief overview. I fear it's taken rather longer than 10 minutes, Sarah. It's been a bit of a cafeteria response, but I think that actually reflects where the compact actually is now. It is still a sort of cafeteria, a range of options and choices, and a lot of interesting, innovative and original kind of engagement with issues of migration and refugees, but very difficult to get a sense of where this dynamic is actually leading to, or if it's leading to a brave new world of migration, international migration and refugee governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, for those incredible insights. Really looking forward to the discussion at the end regarding the global compacts. So thank you. At this point, now we're going to turn it over to the Ethiopia team. First, Mulu is going to share some of the stories of refugee responses that they have seen in Ethiopia. And following that, Fedaku is going to give a presentation of the overall findings from the TRAFIG project that they have had in Ethiopia. So Mulu, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to present to you two stories. And the first story belongs to Jordanos, and it shows family connectivity and mobility. It seems that there are a lot of actors in the first story, and it seems a bit complicated, but after all, we're talking about networks and connectivity, and that's why. So Jordanos is a 20-year-old woman whom we met in Shire while she was working in as a waitress in one of the hotels in Shire. Her family consists of 7 siblings in total, 3 boys and 4 girls. Samuel was the first to move out of the family. He's 38 years old and ranks second in the birth order. He left Eritrea through Sudan in 2007. Once he had arrived there, Samuel didn't have anyone who could support him to continue his journey. As a result, he had to stay in Sudan for 7 years. He only reached Switzerland, where he lives now, after receiving support from his younger brother, Brooke, who had in the meantime made it to Canada, although he had left home a few years after Samuel. And it was in 2012, Brooke, mentioned above, who is 28 and the 6th in the birth order, escaped Eritrea through Sudan with his friends. Before they entered Sudan, human traffickers got them and took them to the Sinai in Egypt, where they were taken as hostages. Subsequently, the family in Eritrea was asked to pay 150,000 nakfa, and later an additional 1.5 million nakfa. The family did all they could, but were able to pay part of the amount. As a result, Brooke was detained and spent 2 months in their hands before being released with the help of a charity organization that facilitated his transfer to Cairo. After staying there for 2 years, he got resettled to Canada. While in Canada, that's how he paid 130,000 nakfa for his brother Samuel, who had been stranded in Sudan, and helped him reach Switzerland from Sudan via Libya and Italy, crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Merhawit, the 5th in the family, was the third to move abroad. Her flight was nevertheless different from that of her brothers. She left the country legally through a family reunification process to join her husband, who fled to Sudan in 2014. There he met with Samuel, Marhawit's brother, with whom he stayed for a couple of months. Unlike the brother, Marhawit's husband was able to move on within a short period because of his family. 9 of his siblings were established overseas already and therefore able to support him to move from Sudan to Sweden soon. By the time the husband was allowed to have his family in Sweden, that's when Marhawit joined him. She had already completed her national service duty in Eritrea, thus could leave the country legally. But she was only allowed to take their youngest child. The rest of their children, who were above 5 years old, joined them later through irregular routes via Sudan and Ethiopia. Jordanos, the sister or our informant whom we met in Shire, the youngest, fled to Shire in Ethiopia in June 2018. 6 months later, her sister, Freta, who was also our informant, the third born of the family, followed her along with her husband and their 2 children. In Shire, both sisters received support from Marhawit's in-laws, who helped them move out of the camp and reside in a rented house. Jordanos and her sister's choice of destination were primarily based on the fact that their brother Brooke is living in Canada. Shortly after we left Shire in March 2020, Jordanos' sponsorship paper from her brother arrived. Their parents, their 34-year-old sister Akberat and 40-year-old eldest brother Johannes still live in Eritrea. They also aspire to move out of the country with their family in the future. However, the family decided to first support Jordanos and the sister in Shire. The choice was based on the fact that a bigger family size requires more support while moving. Though scattered and living in different parts of the world, the family shares responsibility as well as resources. The second story belongs to Musa, and it shows host refugee cooperatives or seizing opportunities and as well as local integration. Musa is an Eritrean refugee from Afar ethnic group, married and with 4 children. He fled to Ethiopia with his family 7 years ago, and he lives in Asaita refugee camp in Afar, a semi-arid part of Ethiopia bordering Eritrea and Djibouti, known for hostile deserts and also pastoralism. On top of the challenge posed by climate change to Afar in all the 3 nations, that means in Eritrea, Djibouti, and Ethiopia, those in Eritrea had been discouraged by the government to continue their lifestyle, often by violent means. In the refugee camp, pastoralism, the traditional predominant livelihood, is increasingly difficult to pursue due to scarcity of land and pastures. Being forced into displacement with their livestock, the community had little chances to reestablish this income activity again, and were therefore happy to pick up the idea of a joint host refugee cooperatives. While the social obligation to share often means that more people have less, on average, for themselves, Asaita is a case in point for the potential of joining forces. In a context where the labor market offers minimal possibilities, the project offered both refugee and host community members new jobs. Musa works in a cotton cooperation project in which 15 refugees cooperate with local ethnic Afars. The project is one of many examples that show how the arrival of refugees has changed the way of life for the locals. They profited from the presence of international NGOs, new jobs, new infrastructure, and new ideas on methods of farming. Musa explained how the cooperation function and which role hosts play. Once we finish our work, we share the profit with the owners of land. Even though they do not work for it, they get the money because it's their land. From 100% of our earnings, we have to give them 15%. The opportunity that refugee has in exile depends largely on their individual economic resources, but they are also determined by the way that the host community perceives them. Musa stresses that Afar in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti believe to share a common culture. This belief shapes the attitude towards the refugee. In Afar, ever since before, the haves do share with the have-nots. That's the culture. Even if we came here displaced, our language, religion, and culture are the same. We do not have that much difference. We came here as a refugee, and they are the landowners. So they gave us what they have, and we did what we can, and decided to cooperate and share profits. In Afar, in contrast to other cases, such as for example in Tigray, there is hardly any mistrust between ethnic Afar from Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. Despite the dividing role of clan membership, hosts, the level of solidarity is high. Refugee and state officials emphasize that Afar is Afar. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mulu. Those were captivating stories, really, really interesting work. Now we'll turn it over to Fedaku to share with us some of the larger findings from Ethiopia that Mulu's cases illuminate.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much. Yes, my presentation is in line with what Mulu read out. That is refugee-driven responses to displacement because of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. I started by reflecting on what Roger just presented on CRRF and this refugee compact. Ethiopia was one of the 17 refugee hosting states that endorses the New York Declaration. And Ethiopia made 9 sets of pledges to support refugees. And in line with that set of pledges, in 2018, a proclamation was drafted with the support of UNHCR. And in January 2019, it was a new revised proclamation was endorsed that focused on employment and the property rights of refugees, the right to get residence permits by refugees, the right to open bank accounts by refugees, and the legally register births, marriages, and other documentations. Then 6 months after the proclamation was endorsed, we were in the field, and refugees can already register births and the marriages, open bank accounts, they can buy SIM cards and so on. However, as Roger was saying, those more complex issues like rights to work, residency permits, local integration, diminishing of encampment, those left unaddressed. And on top of that, now COVID has arrived and a number of issues are pending. With this, let me go to my main presentation. I think I don't think to talk about methodology because this is, it's well known that it is part of our TRAFIG project. We did an extended period of field work. We've interviewed, through a qualitative and a quantitative interview, we've reached up to 500 individuals. So I don't have, in 10 minutes, I can't talk everything. Let me start with the influx of Eritrean refugees. Historically, forced displacement and migration have been historically embedded in Eritrean history. Eritrea fought 3 decades war with Ethiopia, a war of independence. They managed to get independence in 1919. But again, unfortunately, after 8 years in their independence, a border war started with Ethiopia, which is a turning point in Eritrean Eritrean refugees influx to Ethiopia and to Sudan. With that very bloody war in which close to 100,000 people perished, Eritrea more or less lost in the war. That resulted in increasingly turning Eritrean government into authoritative and repressive regime. just with the war, Eritrea started a compulsory and indefinite national military service, and many of the refugees told us that the major reason for their displacement is in relation to the military service. After the war, the border with Ethiopia remained closed for over 20 years until 2018, when a peace deal was made between two governments. During the closure of the border, it was a highly militarized border, so that only male and single young people managed to cross the border. So 73% of Eritrean refugees until 1918 were male and single. Then with the peace deal, the influx increased. Like before the peace deal, average arrival was 50 per day. Then with the peace deal, it increased to 700, average of 700 people per day. But the opening of the border didn't continue. Eritrea closed after like 4 months. But still, the refugee arrival continued in great number. Like when we were in the field, an average arrival was between 200 and 300. So the peace deal, I said, came with a double sword. One restriction was eased. A number of restrictions were eased after the peace deal, but the Ethiopian government also changed it. On the other hand, the refugee admission policy from prima facie, when every Eritrean arriving was admitted, now to a case-by-case approach, so that many Eritrean asylum seekers are informally living in towns in Tigray. Then we did field work, as I said, in 3 areas: Addis Ababa, the capital, in Tigray, and in Afar, as Mulu was reading. Those in Addis Ababa are people who benefited out of this out of camp policy that was meant only for Eritreans who have the capacity to live out of camp if they get a guarantor and the financial means. Then just following on what Mulu read, I focus on 2 things: transnational, translocal and transnational connectivity as refugees' response to displacement. The capability, after arriving in the refugee camps, capability to move onward and break protracted displacement situation is primarily determined by each refugee's connectivity. Networks enable refugees to move out of campus, secure livelihood out of campus, and widen their future in terms of onward mobility. Connectivity helps both officially and unofficially. Officially, for instance, to get or to benefit out of this out-of-camp policy, refugees need a guarantor and a financial means to live on. And unofficial as well, for irregular migration, say many thousand Eritreans have been regularly migrating from Ethiopia through Sudan, Libya, eventually to Europe. And that needs a lot of money for smugglers and transportation. So connectivity is quite important. After arriving in the cities, again, networks provide information about job opportunity, support integration, and many of them participate in business when they don't have a work permit by using citizens' licenses. So connectivity is quite important. But here I say the quality of connectivity and the kind of connectivity is quite important as a pathway for the refugees. I say for those who have quality network, as Mulu was reading about Jordanos, camps are just a transit space where they process their onward mobility. For example, Jordanos came, she didn't spend time in the camp, she immediately moved to Shire because she has someone who supports her as a guarantor as well as who pay her living cost. But for others as well, Some networks support local integration and livelihood, which I'm going to talk, which is part of Mulu's second story. I said, I mean, just this story. Yes, this story I have here is just to show how much campus can be transit space for those who have a quality connection, and for others it is just a place where how they get their livelihood. This guy said, this is a man we met in Addis Ababa, benefiting out of camp policy. He said, we are four when we arrived. One had a US visa. He had to come to Ethiopia because he could not get exit visa from Eritrea because he didn't finish his national service. He left in less than 2 months. One had a brother in Germany and left through Libya shortly. The other one also had a sister in Sweden, left through Libya as well. I was the only who had no close relative abroad. However, thanks to God, I also have cousins in Juba, South Sudan, Canada, and US who support my survival and they pay my kids' school fee. So this shows the quality of the connectivity. But what we see is, you see, this quality of connectivity and generally connectivity depends on the context of the refugees. In this field work, we studied three groups of Eritrean refugees, the Tigrinya speakers who reside in 3 campuses in Tigray, Afar who reside in 2 campuses in Afar, and Kunama who reside in one of the campuses in Tigray. The Tigrinya speakers, Eritrean Tigrinya speakers, they come from highland Eritrea, relatively urbanized. They are the main players in Eritrean politics, both as governing party and in the oppositions. So they have long history of displacement, long history of migration. They have big diasporic community. So they are well connected and highly mobile. So the case Mulu read about network reflects this group of Eritrean refugees. Just one example, according to UNHCR registration, in 2016, 80% of Eritrean refugees who arrived in a Darush camp, which is resided by the Tigrinya, 80% of them left in the first 12 months. So they left either to urban centers or irregularly through Sudan, Libya, eventually to Europe. So that is a different context. A second context is Afar and Kunama. Both of them are political minority in both Eritrea and Ethiopia. They have, migration is new for them. They have less diaspora, less connected, just less mobile. So the second story shows that because what they have, the kind of resource they have is local kinship relation with the host community. So they try to innovatively use that local connection and they strive to survive, you see, by using this local solidarity. So in conclusion, I think my 10 minutes is almost gone. In conclusion, multiple constraining forces prolong refugees' displacement, it prolongs their protracted situation. However, see, regardless of these numerous constraining forces, the refugee environment is dynamic. Refugees use multiple local and translocal networks. Connectivity helps to improve livelihoods, enable mobilities, and broaden opportunities. However, connectivity is determined by the context. This context might be family context, as well as broader group context, like I tried to show the Tigrinya, the Afar, the Kunama, who have different context and a different lifestyle. So it depends on context, it's mainly history of migration, political and economic situation in their country. Yet, those who are less globally connected cultivate their locally available relationship as a resource, at least to reduce their vulnerability. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fikadu. That was really an impressive overview of the dynamism at place in Ethiopia. So thank you very much for that. At this point, next in the agenda, we have the case of Jordan. And so Tamara is going to kick it off for us by presenting a few refugee stories from the field in the Jordan research. Tamara.
Thank you, Sarah. Actually, we do have several interesting stories. And to start with, Jordan is one of the unique countries, as you all familiar with, that hosts a number of refugees that the highest per capita of population over the world. The second interesting thing is that our relationship with Syrians, it's long before the crisis. Because we are neighbors and borders, we have a lot of relationship, intermarriage relationships, relatives. There is so many families, particularly in the northern governorates of Jordan. They are like cousins of southern Syria's people and Damascus. So we have a long relationship of social relationship and also for commerce. So there is a long-lasting relationship. And this is what makes some opportunities for people easier compared with others. I have two stories. One of them, the first one is with Mrs. D. I called her Mrs. D. She's a 40 years old. She had a small houseware shop now. She came to Jordan with her husband and other family members, but she got divorced while she was in Jordan, and her husband left her with no assistance. So she established her small shop by selling her own small piece of gold that she brought with from Syria. And her sister in Kuwait, she supports her with small amounts so she could open her store. Her daughter is married to a Jordanian man, and now she's the only one who supports her family. First, when she established a small shop she established it in a neighborhood where it's many Syrians families lived there. She was successful and she gained the clients and client support and trust. Also, she gained the respect of her other owners or other workers in the neighborhood as well. There's an incident where a few months later, her neighbor, one of her neighbors called Mr. F, he's a Jordanian man, who was having a supermarket, but because he gets ill and he have no sons to stand with him in the supermarket, so he offered Mrs. D a partnership so they could have joint work with this shop and move from her small one to the biggest one of Mr. D. Now she's become even more successful because she expand their works and they have a successful partnership. I would like to mention that this is unusual case because usually women is it's not familiar to work in a supermarkets or in houseware shops by their own, particularly ladies who came from Dara because they have more restriction. But because of her situation that she has to support her family, she has to look for something that could be decent and at the same time not to be in need for other assistance. Particularly, as they mentioned, the assistance has become less compared with the previous period. So this is why my first story. My second story is about Mr. M. He is a 22 years old. He's married with one child, and it's common for people from Dara to get married early, even the males. He usually used to work in Lebanon. He started to work when he was 16 years old. He works with a hard job. He was working in a car workshop, and later he worked as a fisherman. When the crisis happened, his family asked him to leave Lebanon and came to Syria so they could join him to the journey to Jordan. And he came at the age of almost 18. They will have relatives here in Jordan, so that's make them life easier. They came not to the camp, they came to Ramtha city, which is the northern border of Dara. So they came to Jordan, they rent a house. They started to work in the first week they came. His brother and his father, they work as a butcher, but he worked, because he was 18 years old, he worked with a houseware shop. He went by himself to the downtown and he was searching for a job, and he was successfully found one. He spent in his first job 6 years, but eventually he has to left because the salary was not increased and there is a long working hours with no extra compensation. He was offered by one of his friends to work in a restaurant, which is, if you're familiar, that Syrians, they are very good in restaurants and in food industry as well. So he was successful in his second job as well. He works also after his official working hours. He working sometimes occasionally when he has some opportunities like delivery man or cleaning some buildings to gain extra money because he has a big family now. They live in one house. They live in one apartment with 3 rooms. His brother, his married brother, himself, and his parents. And they do have a boy with 12 years old and a daughter of 18 years old. Recently, their parents and his brother and sister have been offered by the UNHCR to move to Canada, and they are happy because of that opportunity. But for the informant that we've met, he was not allowed to do so because they are getting married, so they are out of the official documents of the family. He says that he works fine and his job is good enough, but this he concerns about the future, and he concerns that his earnings won't be sustained in the future, so he would like to migrate as well. I think I left. I still have time in my 5 minutes. Would you like to tell the third story, Sarah, if you wish, or that's enough?
Tamara, I would love it if you shared the third story that you had planned.
Sure.
I think these are really illuminating of the larger processes that we're investigating. So please.
Which one, Sarah, do you like? Do you like the one who have second wife, or the other one? The first one, the lady who have suffered a difficult situation in their journey to Jordan.
I think that is very illustrative.
Okay, yeah. We have a story of a lady. Actually, she suffered a lot while she was in Syria. And first of all, she was not convinced to leave Syria because she would like to stay in her country. She didn't want to leave it. But there is a hard incident they faced them, that one of free military member was around the neighbor, and they suspected that they entered their building. So the formal military troops, they entered their house. They beat them, and they tried to kidnap one of her kids, and they about to burn her house. At that time, there is a clashes renewed again, so they left them and they told them that we will come back. So they've been frightened. So they collect only some official documents with their own clothes, and they just leave immediately to Daraa. When they went to Daraa, one of their family members, they told them that you have to go to Jordan, and we have some people that could send you there with no cost. So they decided to come to Jordan first to stay in Zattari for a short period. She said that it was very difficult time for her to be in Zattari because this lady background that they came from a good condition, economic condition family. They have their own properties, they have their own apartments. Her husband used to have his own shops. So she found herself in a day and night that she has to live in a camp and she has to live in a tent. So it was difficult for her, and she was hoping to move to Ramtha to get out very easy. This story is interesting because her husband has like a denial situation, because he used to have a man with a property, and he refused to work, and he refused to work for others because he said, I used to be the boss. How come now I will be under other people's supervision or being ordered? So she take the lead. She's working because, as she mentioned, also there is an interesting issue that NGOs, they have some kind of nepotism or some kind of unfair standards to give assistance to Syrians. So she said that she's a lady of dignity. She can't humiliate herself by going more and more to these NGOs with limited opportunities to get any assistance. So she has to depend on herself. She's working as a carer with two elderly persons, a Jordanian family. Luckily, they treat her very well, but also what she earned is not enough. So she's attending some of the NGOs training sessions to learn them some crafts. So she's starting to doing something from home so she could sell them and support her family. Her family now, she has big boys, they're not working yet. And one of them is working and the others, they still school leaver. She tried to bring them back to the school, but her sons, even they have this kind of hard conditions. They don't want to return after this kind of breakout. She mentioned something very touchy that this journey has learned her that she wonders how people changed, even relatives. There is a lot of interest, individualism, exploitation. And she said that I will close with her sentence. She said that she has gray hair now because of what she has went through. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Last but certainly not least, Fawaz, we'll turn it over to you to give a presentation on the research findings from the TRAFIG project in Jordan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. Today I'm going to talk. Do you hear me very well? Do you hear me? Sarah, do you hear me?
Yes, yes, Fawaz, we can hear you just fine.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about part of our large project regarding the connectivity. I'm going to talk about the main results with less than 10 minutes. Once we asked the Syrian refugees how many individuals outside their homes they have contact with them, we find that 10% of them, they do not have any contact with any other people within the last week. Also, we found that 10% from 4 to 5 persons, they have a relationship from outside their homes. Who are these persons? You regularly spend time with them outside of your home. We have seen that 60% of them, they are members of their family. Also 32% of them persons that they know from their work, and about 5% from persons born in this place, members of the host community. Also, we asked them about the number of important persons for them, and I'm going to talk for the rest of this presentation about the first important person, not for the second or the third or the 5. Usually 20% of them, they have only one important person. 28 of them, they have 2 persons. 16% of them, they have 3, and 22%, they have from 4 to 5 persons that they consider them as important in their life. Another question regarding does any person who are very important for you currently live in the other places than here? We found that 71 of them, they are living beyond or outside their surroundings, whereas only 71% they are living outside of their surroundings. Also about the important person, what is your relationship to that person? We have seen from the result of the refugees that 32.7% of them, they consider their brothers and sisters as the first important person for them. We have also seen that 13% of them, they consider their mother and father. Unfortunately, 3.6 of them, they consider their husbands, wife, partners as a first important person for them. Regarding the first important person, where in which country is this the person currently living? Country number one, we found that 18% of them, they live in Jordan, 17% they are living in Syria, 7% they are living in Canada, 5% they are living in Germany, 4.6% they are living in Kuwait, and so on. Regarding the medium of, how they're gonna maintain their contact with their persons, the first important person for them, the personal visit, it's only 12%. And 24% only for phone calls and SMS. Regarding social media, such as Facebook, WhatsApp, and others, they have only the percentage, 67% of them. They have contact. They maintain their contact with their first important person. About the important person, how often are they in contact with one another? On daily contact, it's 15%. Not every frequent, 9.6%. And one time a week or less, 12%, whereas several times a week, it's 32.7%. Regarding receiving or giving food and agriculture's produce from the first person, we have seen that they are receiving only 2.6 of them. They receive food and agriculture produce from the first person, whereas also 2% of them, they are giving food and agriculture produce to the first important person. Also, regarding the emotional support, which is very important, such as trust, relation, advice on personal or family decisions, what we have seen, the result that, yes, they are, about 68 of them, they are receiving emotional support. And 68.6 also, they are giving emotional support, meaning that there's a reciprocity in this kind of things. Legal support, unfortunately, we have seen that only they are receiving 2.3 and they are giving 2.3%. If we go to the characteristics of the sample, we're gonna see that most of them they have the Syrian refugees, or the sample of our study, which is 300 participants. Most of them they have primary and secondary school, and some of them they are illiterates. Finally, as I promised that I'm gonna finish less than 10 minutes, financial support, receiving, sending money, provide the credit, etc. The result shows that 20% of them, they receive from the first person financial support. And 3.3 of them, they are giving financial support to the first important person of them. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Fawaz. Very much appreciated. At this point, we're going to turn it back to Roger Zetter to provide a few reflections from what he's heard today. And after that, then we will open it up for the Q&A.
Oh gosh, Sarah, where does one start? Such a incredible kind of rich range of narratives and ideas and themes. Just incredible congratulations to the team on the presentations and the kind of the depth and the width of the coverage of ideas. I'm really kind of a bit stunned that in terms of providing a short response. I could be here for a long time, but let me pick sort of 4 or 5 points that really struck me. And really it's sort of echoing, I think, initially a couple of points that Fakadu made really about the importance of context. The context at, national level, the context at the micro level of the households themselves, and the particular sort of households or particular locations of camps and so on, or where refugees are settled. So context is vital, spatial context, physical context, political context. The second point that was striking, I think, in all the particular case studies is the incredible kind of agency and the strategizing of refugees. I mean, we, as researchers, we know this, we talk a lot about it, we document this process, and policymakers and governments have kind of responded to the rhetoric, but they haven't responded in practical terms, it seems to me, in terms of how can you harness this agency, this energy, this entrepreneurship, the strategizing. I was thinking particularly of the Jordanos family that Mulu was talking about, incredible kind of long-term strategizing of a diasporic household effectively, incredible kind of resources and knowledge base that represents. How on earth do policymakers recognize that? Can they do anything about it? And that, I think, this agency, and that leads to my second point, which I kind of say in a rather kind of dismayed sort of way, the incredible disconnect between the compacts, the policies, what national governments are doing, what donors are doing, and what refugees are actually doing. Their agency, that diasporic family of the Jordanos, and even at the local level, I was thinking of the case of Musa that Mulu was talking about, and the 2 or 3 cases that Tamara was talking about. There's a kind of parallel world here, it seems to me, of the refugees, how they're surviving, how they're developing livelihood strategies, which is in some ways almost disconnected, it seems to me, from the world of policy. It's sort of working in spite of policy, in spite of international norms, in spite of the compacts. People are surviving, they're developing their own means, their own capacities. And in a sense, one says, well, how can the compacts connect with this energy? How can they facilitate and develop this energy rather than, perhaps he's putting it too strongly, rather than almost perhaps standing in the way of this kind of energy? The compacts are billed and presented as opportunities, as positive responses, as creating the modalities for more effective migration governance, more effective engagement of refugee communities. But what these stories are telling me is, in fact, there's an incredible disconnect between what the refugees are doing, what they're trying to do, and what the policy world is doing. Third point, which I think kind of came out, but I think it's very, very important to put it on the table, the gender dynamics, the gender dimensions. I was thinking particularly of Tamara's stories there, particularly the women who, their kind of experiences, the way in which displacement, particularly forced displacement, completely overturns normative gender norms and gender roles in the household. There's a lot of research that we know as academics has been done on this, but how does it relate to the world of policy? How do policy makers connect with the gender dynamics and the gendered consequences of displacement? And particularly I was thinking of that story of Mrs. K and the kind of psychological impacts that displacement has had on her. So that, I think that's another point. The fifth point, I think, and it came out of, again, one of, I think it was the story, another of Tamara's stories. The first one, I think, about the family, her point about the cross-border relations that predated the Syrian crisis between Syrian and Jordanian communities. It's vital, well, put it another way, the policymakers, I think, see forced displacement as a crisis, as a sudden event. But what her story told me is that we have to completely overturn this ahistorical perspective that I think engenders a lot of the response by policymakers and governments and humanitarian organizations to displacement. There is this kind of ahistorical perspective which is so rooted in the crisis mentality and the crisis response to refugee displacement, particularly by policymakers. Sorry, I could go on. And just the final point that struck me is that some of the stories were very much about households that were globally connected, that had knowledge, understanding, capacity, agency at a global level. And then there were the kind of micro level stories. I was thinking of Musa's story in Ethiopia, a very tolerant man just trying to find ways of developing sustainable livelihood in a not very prepossessing environment. Very tolerant of the landlord who'd given him land to cultivate, etc., etc. So you've got this very micro scale. And I just wonder sort of what happens at the meso scale. You've got this kind of macro connectivity, global connectivity. You've got this very, very micro level. But I'm just sort of wondering what happens in between in terms of other kinds of activities, agencies, households, policy-making environments. And sorry, there's one final point. What about those narratives where people don't have any of the capacity to respond in the way that some of these narratives have been incredibly kind of positive, very moving, full of dignity? But there are hundreds of thousands, millions of households who, for whatever reason, don't have the capacity, the resources, a kind of education perhaps to develop a global view on what is creating the context for their livelihoods and their potentialities. Sorry, that's incredibly exciting narratives. I'm getting rather carried away, but thank you, the four of you, for your presentations. They were absolutely super. And I see there are a lot of very interesting questions in the chat as well. I don't know whether I have time to ever look at this.
There are a large number of questions. And I'm going to take a moment as moderator to pose one first. So do please continue to add your questions. The first question I want to ask, Roger spent some time talking about the impacts of COVID on the development and implementation of the global compacts, but I'd like to turn it over to the Jordan team and to the Ethiopia team to perhaps reflect for a moment on the impact of COVID on the research findings. It's been a trying year for 2020. It's almost over. Hang in there, everyone. 2021, however, is poised to be equally challenging, especially with the prospects of a vaccine coming so late in many of these areas. So maybe Fakadu, you can start. And Marcus, I'd also invite you to jump in. If there's anything you'd like to add, maybe you can start, Fakadu, with the impacts of COVID on the research population.
May I start, or Marcus, you start? Do you think? Okay. Thank you. Most of the field work was done before COVID. I would say like 2/3 of it was done before COVID, and like probably 1/3 of the survey, and few of the interviews were done while people are suffering from COVID. The impact of COVID, the major impact, there are complex problems in Ethiopia. Now there is conflict, and the refugees are living in that conflict zone. The major impact of COVID is on people who live on remittances, which means it directly attacked on this connectivity. Because COVID mainly affected the Western world, which is a source of remittance for refugees who live, mainly who live on this out-of-camp policy. They live in the cities counting on remittance. Second, COVID affected in Ethiopia. It affected the labor, the area where they find informal employment, especially construction areas and so on. So many constructions were stuck because of COVID. Informal employments are mainly in bars, in hotels, barber shops. These all are seriously affected by COVID. And these are the major areas where refugees find informal employment. So it's seriously affected the refugees, especially those who live outside the campus.
Thank you, Fakadu. Those are very important insights. I mean, here we are talking about connectivity, and especially remittances as being this, sort of global form of connectivity, and that COVID is even disrupting this.
Probably one point, Sarah. Sorry, one point which I forgot is in terms of connectivity, it also affected mobility as well. I mean, immediately as COVID started, many countries in neighboring Ethiopia, including I see Djibouti, Sudan, Kenya, they all they closed their borders, and those who are en route already, who left Ethiopia, who are en route, were seriously affected. Some of them were deported, others were detained. So that's the part I forgot. Thank you.
Great. Yes, thank you. Marcus, please.
If I can jump in there. I to pick up what we kind of connected to what we've been hearing by Roger Zetter in the beginning, where he said that the philosophical problem of bringing these two compacts together somehow didn't realize it was not only a philosophical one, it was, and that's what Fikar as well mentioned, with Ethiopian joining the Declaration of New York in 2016. It was the original idea to bring people on the move together. And what we see now, and that's why I'm thankful that he mentioned it, is that when we just listen to what the COVID situation now does to people on the move, you see that the people in the diaspora, they're very often left out. And this relates to what you said with a diachronic, not a diachronic way of analysis, so people forget about history. People have been migrants in the past, and they are now supporting other migrants or refugees. And you see as well how this remittances, whether it's from migrants, refugees, or people that have been in the diaspora for decades, is affecting the trajectories of people inside Ethiopia. So I would echo your pledge to get out of the silos and really look at the situation as it is. And while you were speaking mostly about policy makers, I think it's a general problem the academics are in as well. You have your special focus. If you're a migrant researcher, you do only migrants. And if you're a refugee researcher, that's what you look at. And a diaspora guy then has to come find a job in an academic position with history or something like this. So in reality, we see, and this is the beauty of the example we've just heard, that all this connects together, and that dissecting it is not always helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Fawaz, do you want to comment on the situation for the Syrian refugees in Jordan under COVID? You're still muted. Fawaz, you need to unmute the microphone.
Is it okay right now?
Yes,
yes.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have seen that, once we ask the refugees about the general impact, whether they have significant impact, the corona on their life, we have seen that 91% of them, they have seen that there's a significant impact on their life. Also, we ask them about how has the corona impacted their life. For example, I had respective symptoms and health problems myself. 15% of them, they have health problems during the corona pandemic. Their family or other persons close to them had health problems. 8% family members of or friends died due to the coronavirus, it's 0.7 only percent. That's while, you know, there were a limited incidences of corona. Their children couldn't go to the school. 44% of them, they couldn't send their children to the school because, you know, as you know, it was somehow it's closed. Their living situation was difficult. 70% of them, they agree. Regarding the mobility, that about 93% or 40% of them, they couldn't meet each other and felt lonely and isolated at that particular time. I think these results is the same for the Jordanian, because within the curfew, none of the Jordanians are able also to go outside their homes because, you know, the government was very strict. But maybe for the Syrian refugees, it's more worse than the Jordanians. The financial transfer, 80% of them, they have problem with financial transfer, and they couldn't travel to go to other places. 90.9% of them also, they suffer from these things. We have a lot of outcomes about this corona, but, you know, due to the time limits, I think it's not possible to talk about all of them.
Thank you, Fawaz. We're nearing the end of our time, but there is, I think, a really important question that came in from one of the participants. And I think maybe we'll start with Roger, but if anyone else would like to answer, feel free. So it's a general question. I wonder why within the review or evaluation of the Global Compact, there is little to no room to talk about the root causes of the refugee problem. Surely, first thing any meaningful compact could do is address this. So I think it gets to really a key issue that we've all encountered in this research project, which is that there's very little being done to try to stem the movement of refugees at its root kind of source. So maybe Roger, would you like to take the first crack at that answer, and then we can open it up if anyone else would like to also comment.
Wow, that's a challenge in, I think, 3 minutes left or whatever. Yeah, I mean, there is two answers to that. Yes, it was not part of the compact. If you look at the overarching sort of architecture and ambitions of the compact, it was, I've got them here, the 4 bullet points: ease pressure on host countries, enhance refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions. Well, that hasn't happened, as we know, with COVID, particularly resettlement has completely skidded out of existence. And fourthly, support conditions in countries of origin for return. Nothing about, as the questioner has said, about the origins of displacement and forced displacement. And that wasn't, I mean, to be fair, I guess that wasn't the ambition of the compact. The compact was to deal with the consequences and impacts of displacement rather than the root causes. And in effect, although part of one of the more detailed objectives of the compact, if I recall, was to look at processes and policies of sustainable development in countries of origin and in fragile economies, in promoting the SDGs and so on, as ways of, as it were, lessening the propensity of countries to slide into conflict or to generate international migration because of the failure of development strategies. This was part of the one of the more detailed sets of objectives in the compact, but in a sense, one doesn't see this materializing in any way. And the international community has grappled, I suppose, for generations, and certainly in the last 30 to 40 years, with strategies and policies to try and avert the root causes of displacement, but very unsuccessfully, as we know. I'm sorry, it's a very kind of, it's a core question, but both philosophically and in terms of research and in terms of policy engagement, the answer is still being searched for somewhere up there in the ether.
Thank you, Roger. Marcus, did you just have a hand? Oh, no. Would anyone else care to respond? All right. Well, on that note, We are already at the end of time. It was so engaging and so interesting for all of us. And I think we could have gone on for another hour and a half. So thank you very much to you all, Tamara, Fawaz, Fikadu, Mulu for your important interventions, Marcus for your support, and Roger, special thanks to you for joining us with your important insights. Always a pleasure seeing you.
To be engaged. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us as participants and attendees in this really wonderful workshop.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.